Jai Radhe. Nirasya sarva sandeham ekikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Namashristam manumapi shatriputramatra swarupam rupam tasyagrajamurupurim maturim gushtavatim radha kundam girivaramaho radhikamadavasham prapto yasya pratita kripaya shri gurum tam natosmi. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilashojitam Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalaraso Manuvritir Prasanananam Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payo Rasho Muda Kedato Bande Bhagavatani Mananudabam Murdna Nipatyakshito Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Namah Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madanamohano Kuladi Devatama Madanamohan Jar Siva Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala Bhatta Dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Vandan Jaha Hoite Vignanasha Bhishta Puram Adadana-strinam dantoir yacheham puna puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhulisyam Janma Janmani. So by the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava Charjas, Shri Rupa Goswami Pad. Again today we will continue our discussion of Padyavali. So we're here in the Nam Mahatmya Prakaran, the section on the greatness of the name. And in our last discussion we heard a verse of Ishara Puripad, where he prayed to be born 100,000 times so that he could relish the joy of chanting the name of Krishna as he's situated in a hollow in a grove of Kadamba trees in Vrindavan. And we also heard about how what to speak of the purifying power of chanting the name of Bhagavan, even desiring to chant the name of Bhagavan is purifying, such that Brahma becomes ready to offer worship to a person who does so. In gist, along these lines, we heard some praises of the greatness of the name. So today we'll continue in this prakaran with a couple more verses of similar type. So I'm starting from verse 21. Having thus described the profoundly purifying influence of the name, the compiler next cites a verse which describes the fearlessness that is attained by those who chant the name. Pareta-nagarī-purandaraḥ bhaved atha tadīya-kiṅkaraḥ kṛṣṇa-nāma jagad-eka-maṅgalaṁ kaṇṭha-pīṭham urarīkaroti. Who is the ruler of the domain of the departed? And who then are his servants? If one accepts Krishna's name, the one auspiciousness in the world, unto the throne of the throat. I'll read this one more time. Who is the ruler of the domain of the departed? And who then are his servants? if one accepts Krishna's name, the one auspiciousness in the world, onto the throne of the throat. So let's dive into this. The commentator explains that, quote, the departed can refer either to anyone who has died or to a living being situated in Naraka. The, quote, ruler of the domain of the departed is Yamaraj, and the author's rhetorical question, who is he, implies that he cannot do anything to one who chants the name of Krishna, because all the sins of such a person have become destroyed. So as we discussed in the last class, Chitragupta is nervously holding his eraser, ready to erase as soon as the person desiring to chant the name actually does so. So furthering that theme, if Chitragupta is that quick to erase the name of someone who takes the name from the list of sinners to be punished by Yamaraj, then the idea here is, who is Yamaraj then? In other words, if someone is removed from his jurisdiction, then what concern need one have regarding him? So the implication by saying, who is he, is that one becomes free from sins and free from being subject to his authority due to the purity that one acquires and due to the relationship with Bhagavan established by that act of bhakti, which we'll hear about a little bit more in a minute. Quote, then, atha, implies that those who chant the name and thus become completely free from sin go beyond Yamaraj's jurisdiction. So the author's second rhetorical question, quote, who then are his servants, implies that none of them can do anything to one who chants the name, since they, like their master Yamaraj, have no authority over those who chant the name. The commentator cites the following order given by Yamaraj to his servants as evidence of this. Quote, those sadhus of equal vision who have taken shelter in Bhagavan are they whose pure glories are sung even by the devas and siddhas. Do not go near them, for they are fully protected by the club of Hari. Neither we nor time are able to punish them. So this comes in the narration about Ajamil in the Bhagavatam, where it's explained to Yamaraj after his ambassadors or his envoy returned back after being sent away by the Vishnu Dutas who claimed the jurisdiction over Ajamil based on his having called out to his son named Narayan. And so Yamaraj then explains to his envoy why the Vishnu Dutas sent them away and make sure that they don't end up in such a difficult situation again by giving them this order. Don't approach those who take the name because they're protected by Hari. They're in the jurisdiction of Hari. It's not our duty to inflict punishment upon them. The author's purpose for thus metaphorically referring to chanting of the name as, quote, accepting Krishna's name on the throne of the throat, is to indicate that when one takes shelter in Sri Krishna and his name, accepting Sri Krishna as one's guardian and committing oneself to the path of bhakti to him, then one no longer remains in the jurisdiction of Yamaraj, and rather dwells in the domain that is under the divine jurisdiction of Bhagavan Sri Krishna. So, to accept someone on the throne, so to speak, is to accept them as one's king or as one's authority. So, the idea of chanting the name with the throat is being used as a metaphor to refer to taking shelter in the authority of Bhagavan Sri Krishna. So, the chanting of the name is comparable to sitting a king on his throne, which is a nice metaphor in that a king is usually seated nicely, or in other words, he's usually given a nice seat with a nice cushion and a nice appearance and some attendants with some chamaras or some fans or what have you, and he's well looked after. So similarly, if one is to sit the name in one's throat, then this can imply that the name should be sung with great care, great feeling, and great, aptitude in singing to the extent that one may have, as we'll hear about in the next verse. Along these lines, we can draw out a little bit more of the metaphor. So, like this statement is made, and again, as the commentator emphasized, what is the spirit of this verse? It's trying to convey to bhaktas the sense of fearlessness, the sense that by taking shelter in Bhagavan, by chanting the name of Bhagavan, one can reach a state of peace of mind. One can reach a state of becoming free from fear, even in a world that's constantly beset with uncertainty and causes of danger, causes of distress, etc. So the prospect of taking shelter in Bhagavan, the prospect of transcending one's karma, gives one a notion that sooner or later this turbulence will subside to a great extent, or moreover, one's own sense of balance will develop to such an extent that what might feel like constantly distressing, turbulent circumstances, after a while, may just feel like no problem at all. And we'll get to some discussion of that aspect of things also a little bit later in the text. So in any case, the idea is that one need not fear the punishment of Yamaraj or, fire and brimstone and hell and so forth. If one will take shelter in Bhagavan, one will chant his name, and one will do so with the resolve to leave behind all sinful and offensive behavior. Alright, so now we'll come to the next verse, which is very well known, the first verse of the Shikshastakam. So all of 8 verses found in the Shikshastakam are also present in the Padyavali, but they're not all grouped together or in order. So they're, you could say, spiced or distributed throughout according to the themes that are categorized and set apart here in the Padyavali. So here in the Nam-prakaran, the Nam-mahatmya-prakaran, the first verse is cited because this is precisely a verse about that very topic. Whereas other verses, the prayer for pure bhakti and so forth, those come in other sections where the topic is appropriate. So this is a verse which has received much discussion and there are many books written on it, so we won't have by any means a comprehensive analysis of it, but hopefully we can compress something of the gist of the ideas into it. So we'll move now to verse 22. Having thus described the sinlessness and fearlessness that bhaktas can attain by the grace of the name, the compiler next cites a verse by Bhagavan Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, the purifier of the age of Kali, that describes 7 effects of chanting the name, which include not only its purifying capacity, but its also being a cause of the attainment of direct experience of Bhagavan, prema for Bhagavan, and the bliss of such prema. Ceto-darpaṇa-mārjanaṁ bhava-mahādāvāgni-nirvāpaṇaṁ śreyaḥ-kairava-candrikā-vitaraṇaṁ vidyā-vadhū-jīvanam ānandāmbudhi-vardhanaṁ prati-padaṁ pūrṇāmṛtāsvādanaṁ sarvātma-snapanaṁ paraṁ vijayate śrī-kṛṣṇa-saṅkīrtanam. Cleansing the mirror of the mind, extinguishing the mighty forest fire of material existence, shining moonlight on the lily of well-being, the life of the young wife of knowledge, expanding the ocean of bliss, the taste of complete nectar in every syllable, abluting the entire self, śrī-kṛṣṇa-saṅkīrtan supremely triumphs. Alright, so the commentary here is a little bit longer than most because there's these 7 items given in a list all require a bit of discussion. So, first we'll look at the meaning of the key phrase or the subject of the sentence, śrī-kṛṣṇa-saṅkīrtana. What does that mean? So we'll build it up starting from the word kirtan. The compiler defines the term kirtan as follows. Quote, speaking aloud the names, leelas, qualities, and so forth of Sri Bhagavan is called kirtan. So a lot of times we may think of the word kirtan as chanting or specifically chanting with drums and cymbals in a musical manner. And that is a type of kirtan, but that's not all that kirtan refers to. Or kirtan is actually a broader category than that, which can refer to musical praise, if you will, but more broadly refers to speaking in general, or speaking of any type about not only names, but leelas, qualities, and other features, aspects. And in this context of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, where the quote is from, meaning the leelas, names, qualities, etc. of Bhagavan. And the root, kirt, actually, if the most literal sense of it is to repeat or to restate something. So, like, there's another word derived from the same root, kirti, which typically is thought to mean glory or fame or renown, but refers to the idea of, like, that about which repetition is done. In other words, that thing that gets repeated. In other words, something that's praised a lot is called greatness or glory or fame. So similarly, kirtan is to do that repetition or that repeated stating or restating about something. So it does mean praising, it does mean, but more literally it means to speak of or to describe something. So, next we have the term saṅkirtan. So the term saṅkirtan is formed by adding to the word kirtan the prefix samyak. So when you add it according to the rules of grammar, this yak drops out and the m changes to anya by the rules of sandhi. So samyak, saṅkirtan, if you were to isolate the prefix from the root word, means samyak kirtan. So what does this prefix samyak mean? The prefix samyak, which can convey a range of meanings, such as being united, pleasant, and complete. Oh, 1 second here. Oh dear. Let's see if this helps. Okay. So we'll look now at these 3 different senses of the word samyak. So if samyak can mean united, then saṅkirtan can mean one thing. If samyak means pleasant, then we get another meaning. And if samyak means complete, then we can take it in a third way. So we'll give examples of all 3. And for the first 2, I'm using this as a way of explaining the different manner in which Jiva Goswami and Sanatana Goswami have glossed the word saṅkirtan. So Sri Jivapad defines the term saṅkirtan drawing upon the sense of unitedness. Quote, kirtan performed by many having gathered together is called saṅkirtan. This is known to be superior even to the former, that is kirtan, because of its fostering a special type of wondrousness. Which sounds a little funny, but I mean, when you translate it literally, but what it means is that it's just great. There's just something special that happens when you do it together with others. So if we take samyak in the sense of uniting among people, then you get Jiva Goswami's definition, which is kirtan performed by a group. And elsewhere he says, saṅkirtan is the joy of singing about him, singing about Krishna, by many having gathered together. So, Sri Sanatana Pad draws upon samyak's sense of pleasantness in glossing the term saṅkirtan as sweet singing, as enunciation in the form of singing with a deep, tender voice, and as, quote, melodious songs, loud enunciation of names, singing of qualities, glories, and the like, as well as praise, that is, singing of hymns, stabas, stutis, etc. So samyak can also mean something that's pleasant or charming. So samyak kirtan in that sense will mean charming singing or charming, recitation, melodiousness, or otherwise, metric, charming presentation of this enunciation. So both are equally accurate, equally grammatically derived meanings of Sankirtan. So just to pay attention, in Sanatana Goswami's definition, there isn't the implication that it's in a group, which is to say that Sankirtan, as per Sanatana Goswami's definition, is something that an individual could do alone. Because he's taking the prefix samyaks not in the sense of congregational or a group sense, but rather in the sense of pleasantness or charmingness, and referring to the manner in which the kirtan is done. So then we'll go with one more possibility, which is the sense of completeness that the word samyak can convey. And this is as follows. Sri Jivapad also describes in his Krama-sandarbha-tika on Srimad Bhagavatam that utterance of Sri Bhagavan's name can be of two types, plain, kevala, and imbued with affection, sneha-samyukta. The former type can cause attainment of Sri Bhagavan's abode, but only the second type can cause attainment of that and the attainment of nearness to him. So I mentioned this in one of the previous classes. This is, I think, quite an interesting point, that if one chants the name, one can get moksha, but what type of moksha will one get? If one chants the name, but one doesn't do so with sneha, one doesn't do so with prema, will one go to Vrindavan? Will one reach that plane where all the parikaras are steeped in the most deep type of prema that can be found? No. Right? We hear that in Vaikuntha, not even everyone has bhakti exactly. There are just liberated souls that are like citizens in this divine city who have respect and have, a clean nature and live like citizens with distant regard for a king. So if one chants the name without a type of prema that would warrant and that would make intimacy meaningful, then why would it happen? So it's entirely possible that some persons who achieve liberation by means of namabhas may end up in that sense, in that sort of condition, where they have salokya mukti, but they don't necessarily have samipya, and they don't necessarily have a specific type of prema. So therefore Jiva Goswami makes this distinction, saying that, but when the name is chanted with sneha, meaning affection or love, then one can achieve samipya, or then one can come in proximity to Bhagavan, one can be near him, one can have the opportunity to personally serve him, because what real satisfaction is there in being served by someone who doesn't actually love you? In the world you can say, well, that's, the professionalism or something, but for Bhagavan, that's not enough. Or in other words, why would Bhagavan be bothered with that? Rather, unless there's that thing that is the very life of the activity, that is the sole actual relish, the quality of prema, then what is there in being, offered some articles or, shown some formal respect? There's no real taste in that. So, in this way, if the name can be taken in different manner, then to say that Sankirtan is, quote, complete kirtan, you could draw this interpretation, that drawing upon the samyak sense of completeness, the term Sankirtan can also be defined as kirtan of Sri Bhagavan's name imbued with affection for Sri Bhagavan. And Sri Jiva also notes in this regard that affection is the cause of the life within any form of service to Bhagavan. So this is the point I was just making. And This particular third interpretation I drew from the commentary on the Shikshastakam by Anantadas Babaji Maharaj, and throughout his commentary on the Shikshastakam he draws significantly on earlier Bengali commentaries on the Shikshastakam by Radha Govindanath, by Krishnapada Das Babaji Maharaj and other writers. But this particular point I didn't see in the earlier Bengali sources that he used for his commentary. So this may be an insight of his own, or perhaps it comes from another source, but I wasn't able to trace it. In any case, I thought it was worthwhile of inclusion, as it's not precisely an interpretation of the word Sankirtan as the two that I've given above, directly from the works of Jiva and Sanatan, but you could call it a derivative meaning, and I think it's, at least in my personal opinion, I think it's quite a worthy one. So, moving on. The commentator explains that the compound śrī-kṛṣṇa-saṅkīrtan refers to Sankirtan of the name of Sri Krishna, or of the name of Krishna along with Shri, that is, his intrinsic potency, Radha. And that, quote, supremely triumphs can indicate that Sankirtan of Sri Krishna's name triumphs above all else, or that Sankirtan of Krishna's name along with that of Shri, meaning Radha, is supreme, and thus Sankirtan of their names triumphs supremely. So, this brings us up to that whole compound, śrī-kṛṣṇa-saṅkīrtanam. So you could take Shri as a separate name for Radha, Radha Krishna Sankirtan, or you could take Shri as just a qualifier of Krishna, as it often is, and therefore it simply refers to Krishna Sankirtan. And the idea of interpreting Shri as Radha, I would think, would be the secondary sense, or an implied sense that might be taken by those who are inclined to that line of thought, but the sense of simply Krishna, who's qualified as Shri, would be the primary sense. As, at least in my personal inclination, this verse can be looked at in different ways, and sometimes I see that a number of commentators are of the line of thought where they're trying to see this verse as propagating Nama-sankirtan over and above everything else and trying to establish some kind of definitive, ultimate, super excellence of Krishna Sankirtan. And you can read the verse in that way. I'm not opposed to seeing it that way, but personally I'm more inclined to seeing this as something more broad, and that Mahaprabhu's propagation of Nama-sankirtan as the Yuga Dharma was something that was intended to be broad. It was something that was intended to be inclusive for wide swaths of the social section, and something that would be applicable and appreciable to persons of many different sentiments, inclinations, and so forth. So the idea being, maybe not everyone, even among his parshads, could understand what he relished in the Gambhira and what he inspired the Goswamis to write, but they could nevertheless join in the Sankirtan that he led, and they could nevertheless, all the villagers he met on all his tours, and the broad, wave of love that he spread through this broad, simple, leaning towards universalist type of practice. I'm inclined to see that there's some sense of that in this initial verse, in this broad verse, that Sankirtan has this very broad set of qualities and broad set of effects that it can produce. And no doubt the Shikshastakam then goes more and more fine into things that are more unique to Mahaprabhu's personal focus and worship. But I think part of the intent of the verse is to write something that is of broad universal appeal. So to interpret it only as praise of Radha and Krishna alone, I think it's fine to read it that way, but to say that that's the primary intended sense, I personally wouldn't lean in that direction. Anyway, that's my personal sense on the the commentator's alternate interpretation. So now let's look at how Kaviraj Goswami has spoken about this verse in the Charitamrita. In the final chapter of Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, Sri Krishna's Kaviraj Goswami recounts on an instance of how Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, whom the compiler refers to as simply Sri Bhagavan in the verse attribution above, teaches this verse, which is the first of the 8 verses that constitute the one and only universally recognized written composition of Sriman Mahaprabhu. Quote, "With delight, Prabhu said, 'Listen, Swarup and Rama Rai. In the age of Kali, Nama-sankirtan is the best means. One who performs worship of Krishna by means of the sacrifice of Sankirtan is of fine intellect and attains Krishna's feet.' This is stated in Srimad Bhagavatam. Quote, 'Those of fine intellect verily worship with sacrifices consisting primarily of Sankirtan, he whose complexion is swarthy, and who is also non-swarthy by virtue of his luster, and who is replete with his limbs, sublimbs, weapons, and associates.'" End quote. From Nama-sankirtan comes the destruction of all ills, anarthas, the appearance of all auspiciousness, and the elation of prema for Krishna. The 3 effects of Nama-sankirtan listed in the final sentence of this quoted passage are a condensed summary of the verse under discussion, wherein 7 descriptive qualifiers of śrī-kṛṣṇa-saṅkīrtan are stated. These 7 qualifiers are restated as follows in the Bengali explanation of this verse that follows its citation in Chaitanya Charitamrita. Quote, "First, from Sankirtan comes the destruction of sin and samsara, purification of the psyche, chitta-shuddhi, the appearance, that is accomplishment, of all types of bhakti sadhana, the appearance of prema for Krishna, the taste of the nectar of prema, attainment of Krishna, and immersion in the ocean of the nectar of service to Krishna." These 7 qualifiers will now be explained individually in accord with their order in the verse under discussion, and the correspondence between them and this aforesaid Bengali translation will be noted. So I have to say one point in this regard, is that in all the editions of the Chaitanya Charitamrita that I study, not a single one of them provided a full mapping of the Bengali translation of this verse onto the Sanskrit verse. And I found this a little bit peculiar because some of these commentators are extremely astute, and a number of them say that these Bengali payars render what's in the verse, and some of them show the equivalence between some of the items in the translation to some of the compounds in the verse, but none of them actually produce a one-to-one correspondence between them, which I found odd and a little bit lacking in the commentary, because I'm inclined to the thought that if Kaviraj Goswami is rendering this into Bengali and there are 7 compounds in the verse and he gives 7 compounds in his translation, that he was trying to present things in a parallel manner. So I'll mention there's 2 particular ones that none of them directly equate. So I've gone out on a limb. I very rarely do this, but I've gone out on a limb and made a claim or presented in this explanation some reasoning as to why and how a full set of correspondence can be offered. So when those points come up, I'll mention them ahead. But just saying that because I try to be studious and diligent in conveying what the great Vaishnavas of the 20th century and other writers whose works we have access to put forward the wonderful deliberation and presentation of the texts as they've interpreted them. So it's only in very rare cases that there seems to be something lacking or something that was overlooked in the pre-existent literature. So anyway, that's one point of consideration that will arise as we go through this analysis. So now we'll come to point number 1. So the first compound in the verse is ceto-darpaṇa-mārjanaṁ, or cleansing the mirror of the mind. The mind is compared to a mirror in this verse because objects are perceived within it in a manner that is similar to how objects are perceived in a mirror. When a mirror is covered with dust, objects cannot be accurately perceived within it. But when a dirty mirror is cleaned with pure water and a fine cloth, then objects can be perceived accurately within it. Similarly, when the mind is polluted, objects cannot be accurately perceived within it. But when the polluted mind is purified, then objects can be perceived accurately within it. What then is it that, quote, pollutes the mind in a manner similar to how dust covers a mirror? So backing up a step, the metaphor cleansing the mirror of the mind implies that there's some dirt on the mirror, meaning some dirt on the mind. So to understand the idea of cleansing, we have to understand what it is that's being cleansed. What is the dirt? So this can be taken in many ways. I've provided a few examples of how this is discussed. Srimad Bhagavatam describes lust, greed, and the like produced by conceits of I and mine as contaminants of the mind. So from the sense of I and mine based on the body and the material mind come the tendency to pursue objects within the material sphere, and when those desires are exacerbated or frustrated, then we experience anger, greed, and envy, and all these other things. So these can be considered pollution in the mind. Moreover, as well as the residual effects of karma, meaning the inclinations produced by past karma to perform future karma. So every action we perform deepens particular samskaras in the mind, or particular impressions that action establishes in the mind, which then condition the mind towards further thought of such action again, which in most cases leads to repetition of the behavior or to aversion of the behavior, depending on the nature of the content. And from that deepening of the samskaras, we acquire vasanas, or we acquire this, disposition, proclivity, or specific inclinations towards or against certain activity. So all such inclination of the mind, the word vasana is sometimes also derived grammatically from the sense of scent, of fragrance. So just as when there's a bad smell in the air, people typically will take some action to alleviate it or to leave the place or something like that. Similarly, when this smell the mind is pervaded by these inclinations towards these different, for or against particular material experiences, then you can say that the mind is polluted there, just as if someone walks into a place filled with some stench that usually affects their behavior in that place. And, quote, broadly, objects of the senses themselves, meaning all forms of external sensory experience that condition the mind towards any and all objects other than Sri Bhagavan. So this is it's based on another citation in the Bhagavatam itself, Vishaya-vidhushitashaya, which is quite a deep statement to say that the totality of material experience is contaminating of the mind. That as opposed to saying some things in the world are pure and good and fine and some are not, this is saying anything and everything, all forms of cognition are in one sense pollution other than cognition of Bhagavan, other than one-pointedness upon the ultimate object who is most worthy of attention. And you might say, well, does that mean we should just, put on blindfolds and earplugs and live in a cave as much as possible? Not necessarily. It can also mean that one's intent, one's awareness is focused on Bhagavan pervasively throughout all the circumstances that one acquires, in the midst of all the relationships that one sustains, and so forth. So to see other than Bhagavan, the tendency to see anything and everything independent of Bhagavan, this can be conceived as the contamination in the mind. And we have further examples of what contamination can be understood to mean. Sri Jivapad cites a verse from Brahma-vaivarta Puran in his Bhakti-sandarbha that describes sin in particular as a cause of contamination of the mind. And he also describes impurity of the mind as offensiveness and the like towards Bhagavan's bhaktas. That is comparable to a layer of cement that is very difficult to remove and completely blocks perception of Sri Bhagavan. So just as a brick wall is something you can't see through, similarly aparad is like a layer of cement or a brick wall blocking you from having experience of Bhagavan. So these are two different ways it can be understood. In one way, any and all worldly experience is contaminating. In another sense, specifically sin and aparad is what is to be considered contaminating. Both ways of seeing it have their application. So if we integrate these things together, then we get the following. Pollution of the mind can thus be broadly summarized as being constituted of the five types of affliction, as described in the Yoga Sutra, which a passage of the Yoga Sutra which is cited by Jiva Goswami Pad, Chakravarti Pad, and their commentaries on Bhagavatam. So this fivefold affliction is described as ignorance, avidya, asmita, egotism, attachment, raga, enmity, dvesh, and clinging to life, or abhinivesh. So there's the absence of awareness of Bhagavan. In that absence, there's a false sense of self. Then, on the basis of that conceit of self, there is attachment to particular objects, enmity or aversion towards other objects, and there is a clinging or a riveting onto the condition of living out that false sense of self, namely living as this body in the world, surrounded by those objects perceived to be favorable and free from those objects perceived to be unfavorable. This whole game, if you will, of trying to keep oneself in that combination of circumstances is called suffering, or it's called, the fivefold affliction. So all of that absence of awareness of Bhagavan, as well as that false sense of self, as well as all the attachment, enmity, etc. based on it, all of this can be considered contamination of mind, because what is meant to be in the mind, prema for Bhagavan, thought of Bhagavan, initiative to serve Bhagavan, perception of Bhagavan, this is the mind functioning as it's meant to be. So, one way that this is illustrated is in a citation of the Vishnu Dharma Puran Jiva Goswami gives in the Bhakti-sandarbha. Quote, "A heart polluted by attachment and so forth is not a place for Madhusudan, for a swan is never bound by affection to muddy water." So just as a lot of mud in the water makes the water considered contaminated or impure, similarly, all this attachment, all of these notions of pollution, when they're in the heart, then that heart is not a place for Madhusudan. It's not a place where Bhagavan will be present or where Bhagavan will be directly perceived. So, thus, in summary and in essence, pollution of the mind is any intent within it upon any object other than prema for Sri Bhagavan. So this is like Jiva Goswami's sledgehammer, which he gives in the Priti-sandarbha. Ashaya Shuddhi Nama cha anya tatparya parityag priti tatparyam cha. This is like the whole thing really, really condensed down to the core, as per the Gaudiya viewpoint. So, Kṛṣṇa-saṅkīrtan, what does it do? It can remove all that intent, all that pollution of all these types, and bring about that state in which the mind is intent only upon priti for Bhagavan, upon Bhagavan. So, Sri Kṛṣṇa-saṅkīrtan can purify the mind of all the aforementioned forms of pollution in a manner similar to how pure water in a fine cloth can purify a mirror, such that the mind can become a site where Sri Bhagavan is vividly perceived, in a manner similar to how an object is clearly perceived in a mirror. The specifics of how perception of Sri Bhagavan takes place in a purified mind through the agency of rati, that is, bhava bhakti for Sri Bhagavan, are explained by Sri Rupapad in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. Typo here. Quote, although self-luminous in form, this rati appears in a vritti of the mind, assumes the state of its nature, and shines like something that needs to be illuminated by that vritti, although it is actually self-luminous. In reality, this rati is taste itself just by its own nature, yet it enters the state of being the cause of tasting its objects, Krishna and so forth. So when the Sarup Shakti, or the combined essence of the Samvid and Ladini functions of the Sarup Shakti is manifest into the mind in what we call rati or bhava, then that acts like one of the functions or one of, loosely speaking, thoughts in the mind, as if it were just another thought in the mind. It seems just like any other thought, and yet it's not. It's something that's purely of spiritual nature. And then, as it assumes the nature or functions just like a conventional vritti or a conventional function within the psyche, then it seems to be something that that needs to be supported by, or needs to be I'll just say supported by the rest of the functioning in the psyche. But actually, it itself is driving the process, and it itself is capable of affecting this experience of cognition. And then that rati, functioning the way a normal vritti would lead to the perception of an object, it also produces the perception of objects, but this time the objects are purely spiritual in nature. So Krishna can now be an object of perception of the mind. So even though the mind is, quote, material in the conventional sense, it can be a site or a host for direct perception of Bhagavan when the software running on the hardware, so to speak, is of Bhagavan's own nature, or is Sarup Shakti in nature, namely when it is rati. So kṛṣṇa-saṅkīrtan can lead to, or can purify the mind, make it a fit site for that descent of the Sarup Shakti, for that presence of rati, and then one will experience in the mind, or have a perception in the mind of Krishna, just as conventionally in the mind we have perception of material objects. So because Sri Kṛṣṇa-saṅkīrtan can purify the mind so that it can thus function as a site of perception of Sri Bhagavan, it is described here as being, quote, cleansing of the mirror of the mind, and is referred to as purification of the psyche, chitta-shuddhi, in the aforementioned Bengali translation. So, simply put, ceto-darpaṇa-mārjanaṁ, this metaphor for the mirror, what is it really referring to? It just means that Nama-sankirtan purifies the citta of what is unfavorable to bhakti, what is unfavorable to Krishna Prem, or all that is not Krishna Prem. This is in gist the idea. So I'll do one more point for today, and then we'll conclude. So the second compound in the verse is bhava-mahādāvāgni-nirvāpaṇaṁ, extinguishing the mighty forest fire of material existence. Material existence, that is samsara, is compared to a mighty forest fire, because the plight of jivas within samsara is akin to the plight of plants and animals trapped in a mighty forest fire. As such plants and animals suffer severely, have no means of escape, and have no means to extinguish the fire, so jivas in samsara suffer severely, have no means to get out of samsara, and have no means of their own to remove the existential sufferings they face in samsara. The suffering undergone by jivas in samsara is often summarized as being of three types, or literally as being three types of heat, or tap, which is applicable here to the metaphor with the forest fire. So those are the miseries that arise by means of the body and mind, that is, those that are, quote, related to the self, adhyatmika. Miseries that arise by means of other entities, that is, those that are, quote, related to entities, adhibhotika. And miseries that arise by means of destiny, that is, those that are, quote, related to destiny, adhidaivika. Irrespective of any amount of wealth, technology, fitness, and the like that one may acquire, no embodied being in samsara can evade undergoing the 6 inevitable transformations of embodiment, namely birth, existence, growth, change, decay, and death, and the sufferings that inevitably come along with these transformations. Be that as it may, as plants and animals suffering inside a forest fire can be saved from such suffering if rain clouds arise and shower heavy rain that extinguishes the fire, so jivas suffering in samsara can also be saved from the 3 miseries if they engage in śrī-kṛṣṇa-saṅkīrtan, which, like a heavy rain cloud, can extinguish their forest fire-like suffering. How does śrī-kṛṣṇa-saṅkīrtan do this? Well, what is samsara? Samsara, in essence, exists for a particular jiva because a jiva has beginningless ignorance of Sri Bhagavan, a sense of independence from Sri Bhagavan, and a psyche conditioned by desires for objects within samsara that prompt the jiva to perform actions that perpetuate their own ignorance and sense of independence and also cause suffering as a reaction, that is, sins. So this particular point, where is it? Sorry, I'll just recap this. So, how we hear that jivas exist in 2 categories, those in samsara, those out of samsara. Those that are in samsara, how is it said that they're in samsara? It's said that they're in that beginninglessly. But what is still, so to speak, the basis of this beginninglessness? Although to be beginningless is to be causeless and thus have no fundamental cause, nevertheless, inside that causelessness, Sri Jiva still gives some hierarchical analysis or causal analysis, and he goes to the root by saying that there's an absence of awareness of Bhagavan, or there's a beginningless ignorance. That has no cause. It's not the Jiva's fault, it's not Bhagavan's fault, nobody fell into it, none of this. It's just a beginningless absence of awareness. And in that beginningless absence of awareness, there's then this sense of independence, or this false sense of self, that's able to retain its appearance of being truthful because of the absence of the awareness of the actual situation. And then, in that absence of the actual reality, as running along with the false reality, then there's the whole programming of the mind that takes place on the basis of that false self, which primarily functions on the desires that one acquires in the hope of producing satisfaction and avoiding suffering for that false self that one identifies to be self. So this third sense is the most, you could say, practical sense, and this is a statement that Baba often quotes, Krishnaiva hi samsara. This is a statement of Chakravarti Pad in his Bhagavatam commentary, that if you boil it down really, practically, what is samsara? It's just these desires you have in your mind. This is samsara, because this is what perpetuates your existence in samsara, and unless and until these change, and unless and until your mind is predominated by desire for Bhagavan, you will have no experience but perpetual experience of samsara. So this is a very poignant way of summarizing the condition of the jiva, is to simply say, these desires you have for things of the world, that is samsara. Because that will also shape the future lives that you live, that will also shape your experience of what the world is. That will be the world you live in, so to speak, in the future, for better or for worse in the worldly sense, as well, as per what we call tat kritu nai. So, moving on, so we have this notion of samsara. This, I'm giving threefold analysis based on 3 different sources. And with these 3 things, we have jivas perpetuating of their own accord, their own entanglement and suffering within the bindings of samsara. So, what does śrī-kṛṣṇa-saṅkīrtan have to do with this? śrī-kṛṣṇa-saṅkīrtan dispels this ignorance, removes this false sense of independence, and enkindles desire for Sri Krishna rather than objects within samsara and further performance of sin. So the very elements that are the core basis of how one is in and one remains in samsara, by doing sankirtan, those very things are uprooted. The absence of awareness of Bhagavan is removed by doing kirtan of Bhagavan, by making oneself aware of who is Bhagavan, by making oneself aware of the glories, the qualities, etc. of Bhagavan. The sense of independence is negated by doing sankirtan because one is engaging in the optimal act that is suited to the nature of the jiva, namely service to Bhagavan. So one is not acting independent of Bhagavan, one is acting in connection with Bhagavan, one is acting in service to Bhagavan. And by doing sankirtan, by hearing the glories of Krishna, desire for Krishna, desire for devotion to him, desire for prema for him, desire for his pleasure, all of these things can become nourished within the mind, which proportionately will displace the tendency to desire things of the world. So the very core elements that sustain the jiva's conditioning in samsara are all negated or are all attacked or, countermeasured by Krishna Sankirtan. So in that sense, as you can, dissipate or you can negate the presence of fire by throwing water on it, similarly throwing Sankirtan on this conditioned mind is like, extinguishing the fire. Śrī-kṛṣṇa-saṅkīrtan dispels this ignorance, removes this false sense of independence, and enkindles desire for Sri Krishna rather than objects within samsara and further performance of sin. Because śrī-kṛṣṇa-saṅkīrtan eradicates the root cause of samsara, namely obliviousness of Sri Bhagavan, and engenders intentness upon Sri Bhagavan, Śrī-kṛṣṇa-saṅkīrtan is said to be, quote, extinguishing of the mighty forest fire of samsara, and is referred to as the, quote, destruction of sin in samsara in the aforementioned Bengali translation. So, like a big rain cloud showering down cool, refreshing rain, saving all the poor stranded plants and animals in the forest fire, then the showers of this Nama-sankirtan, Krishna-sankirtan, are giving that rescue, relief, refreshment, and gratification and joy to living beings in the world. So there we have explanation of the first two elements listed among these 7 in this opening verse of the Shikshastakam. So I'll conclude there for this round, and in our next class we'll move to the remainder of the content in this first verse of the Shikshastakam. So I conclude here. Vaishnavebhyo namo nama. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.